Goldinger. She has been well known as an American lawyer who has worked with the Venezuelan government and was close to President Chavez. Your reaction on this day after his death?
Well, it's incredibly sad, of course. It's a tremendous tragedy for Venezuela, for people of Venezuela, for people of Latin America. I would say also for people around the world who fight for social justice. Chavez was a champion for the poor, for social justice, against imperialism, against aggression, against war. He's someone who has left an extraordinary legacy, not just in his own country, I think, but around the world. It's an unbelievable tragedy that someone so young, with so much energy, with so much charisma, and with so much determination to continue building his great country and this concept of La Patria Grande, the great homeland in Latin America, would leave us so soon. So I think that Venezuelans and peoples around the world are going to mourn seriously his loss. From two Venezuelan Americans, we go to Greg Grandin, also in our New York studio, currently a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library, author of Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the United States, and the Rise of New Imperialism. His most recent book, Fordlandia, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His new book is called Empire of Necessity. It'll be published later this year. Greg Grandin, talk about who Hugo Chavez was. Give us a little short history of his life.
Well, in many ways, if you look at how his life tracks the history of Latin America, it's quite amazing. He was born a few days after the 1954 coup in Guatemala that drove Jacobo Arbenz from power. And that coup, in many ways, culminated the subordination of Latin America to the United States in the Cold War.
Because the U.S. was involved.
The U.S. led that coup, yeah, and that happened in a few days. And his life pretty much ran the whole trajectory from that moment forward of U.S. power in Latin America. It saw the rise and extension of U.S.-backed militarism throughout the region. Venezuela, a little bit less than some of the other more homicidal anti-communist countries, but nonetheless, Venezuela was closely allied to the United States during the Cold War. He came of age under a political regime that was often held up as a little United States, in which two ideologically indistinguishable parties traded power back and forth between 1958-59 up through the 1990s, and then he died, and Latin America has largely led this remarkable movement for independence that he helped broker. When he came to power elected in 1998, when you think about it, the whole region was governed by neoliberals, or pretty much allies and executors of the Washington Consensus neoliberalism, and he was the first person that began to challenge that in power. Lula in Brazil, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva was elected in 2002, Nestor Kirchner in 2002, Evo Morales a few years later, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. But it really was, in some ways, Chavez that led that remarkable, incredible movement that's world historical. It's unprecedented.
And one point I made in my column in the Daily News today on Chavez is that to the degree that he was seen by the United States and Europe as the most radical of Latin American leaders, he created space for an enormous diversity of other left-oriented leaders that seemed almost more acceptable to the West up against the figure, the lightning rod figure of Chavez.
Yeah, for a long time, what Washington policymakers and opinion makers were trying to create this idea that there were two lefts, a good left and a bad left in Latin America, a vegetarian left and a carnivore left. And the kind of emblematic leaders of that was Lula in Brazil, a reformist, administered within the institutions of law, and Chavez, fiery populist is a description that I'm sure has been used kind of like Mad Libs and in obituaries of Chavez. But in reality, they actually worked together very, very nicely. I mean, if you read the WikiLeaks cables, the U.S. was constantly trying to push this notion of a division or a divide between Brazil and Venezuela, and Brazil constantly rebuffed it. And certainly Chavez's more flamboyant style on the world stage created a much more willingness to work with so-called more moderate reformers like Lula. And I would argue that their differences had more to do with the political structures that they inherited than anything. And I think they both, in very real ways, had exactly the same goal.
I'd like to ask Gregory Wolper, you've written extensively extensively on the Venezuelan revolution, but especially you have focused on what most of the rest of the people in the United States and other parts of the world have not seen, which is the domestic impact of Chavez's revolution on the everyday life of the Venezuelan people. I'm wondering if you could talk about that. For instance, you've written that the number of cooperatives in Venezuela escalated from about 1,000 to 100,000 during the Chavez years. Could you speak about that?
Yeah, I mean, Miguel Tincasadas mentioned a couple of those changes, such as the decline in poverty, which is very important. I mean, there are certain things that people always focus on, and certainly the poverty one is very important, which declined by half during Chavez's presidency. Also, extreme poverty declined by more than 2/3. But in addition to these kind of standard of living improvements that happened for Venezuela's poor majority, there were also these elements of participatory democracy that had been introduced with Chavez's election. One of the most important, I think, is actually the introduction of communal councils in Venezuela. Over 30,000 communal councils were introduced, which are basically direct participatory, direct democratic structures throughout the country where people work on neighborhood improvement projects, and they really feel like they have a stake and acquire an ownership of their community. This is just one example, and of course the cooperatives and self-managed workplaces are others. I mean, Chavez was really trying to introduce socialism and putting it on the map, really, back again on the map for the 21st century. And it wasn't just an economic socialism, but also a political socialism, by which he meant a participatory democracy, which is what he was trying to create.
And that's an image quite different from what we receive here of an authoritarian leader.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, certainly Chavez had his top-down management style, which certainly clashed and bothered many people. But on the other hand, one cannot deny, I think, that participation in Venezuela increased. From any measure that you look at, whether it's the Latino Barometro polls, which show that Venezuelans believe that their democracy is more democratic than it had ever been, and in comparison to what other people say of other countries in Latin America, and also that they're participating much more in elections. I mean, participation and registration have increased dramatically. Voting centers, polling stations throughout the country have been distributed to poor neighborhoods where people used to have to wait a whole day in order to vote. Now it's reduced tremendously, and it's much faster. So there's just in every measure, like I said, there's more participation in the democratic process.
Well, I think he did. Chavez really put his finger on legitimate grievance of social injustice and social inequality in Venezuela and throughout much of Latin America. He deserves a lot of credit for that, and I think that was his great contribution. The problem is I don't think he really constructed an alternative after 14 years. And I think mainly because his style, his approach was that he made all the decisions. He concentrated power in his own hands. And that's very, very difficult to construct an effective system, a governance model, when only one person makes all the decisions. So my sense is that he had a great opportunity because he had tremendous charisma, connected with the Venezuelan people, cared about the Venezuelan people, and the Venezuelans felt that. And he had a lot of resources. The oil prices went up substantially from the time he came in 1999 till now. He really had an opportunity to reshape in a significant way and put the country on a sustainable path of development. I'm not sure that if one looks at Venezuela today that it's on that path. And I think you have enormous problems that are there. There are shortages of basic goods. There's highest inflation rate in Latin America. Crime is off the charts. If you look at the crime rate when he came in versus the crime rate today, there's tremendous insecurity. Caracas is one of the most crime-ridden cities in the world today. So this is not a government that I think has been very competent and very effective. And I think it's a product of the fact that he is somebody who believes that he represents the general will of Venezuelan people. He is a legitimate president. There's no question about that. But you also need to, I think, bring in other sectors of the society. And he was a very polarizing figure. So I think he deserves credit. I think his legacy is a mixed one. But I think in the end, this will be seen as a great opportunity for Venezuela that was squandered in the end.
Ava Gollinger, your response.
Well, I think that at least Michael Shifter recognized Chavez's legacy in terms of changing the lives of Venezuelans, and particularly the poor. But I strongly disagree with the assessment of the fact that he didn't build, one, a sustainable model, two, an alternative, viable alternative for the country and for the region. Because before, as Greg was saying, Chavez opened the door, opened a pathway, began that pathway, and took that road to transforming Latin America forever. I mean, Venezuela has been transformed forever. Talking about the level of participation. Today in Venezuela, more Venezuelans participate than ever before in history. Everyone has a voice. Everyone wants to be active and involved. Before Chavez came to power, and I lived there during that time, it was a country full of apathy, full of exclusion. People who didn't even care about participating because their participation meant nothing. That's changed 100% and will never reverse its course. At the same time, much has been focused on Chavez, the man Chavez, because he was an all-encompassing figure. He was larger than life. You know, he had this enormous personality and tremendous charisma. But at the same time, the vision that he had and that he began to implement collectively along with the people of Venezuela was about power to the people. And I think there's no question that that has taken root in the country today. And we've seen it. Even after Chavez was elected in October and then was diagnosed again that the cancer had returned, and he was unable to participate in elections that followed after that for governors, for regional elections. Nonetheless, he didn't appear in one campaign event. His party won in 20 out of 23 states in the country. I mean, it was a clear showing of the leadership that was growing within the ranks of his party. At the same time, we've seen, people are pouring into the streets of Venezuela and have been throughout this time period saying, "I am Chavez." And that doesn't just mean, I love Chavez. It means Chavez represented me, represented my family, my community, my interests. And I think that today what we're seeing in Venezuela, through these communal councils, through all this popular participation, is a collective leadership that has grown. And I think that in the end, that was Chavez's overall objective, how to transfer that power into the hands of the people, empower the people so that they feel they have the capacity to govern their nation. And I think that has unquestionably happened in Venezuela, and that's one of the strongest elements of Chavez's legacy.